Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Watch No Evil. This is Matt,
And this is Zach.
and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2017 movie Cargo, starring Martin Freeman as the lead character in this Australian post-apocalyptic zombie horror movie. One of the main themes throughout this movie is the use of and reference to Aboriginal culture and the juxtaposition of sort of Western or Eurocentric practices. Specifically with this type of virus, the idea behind it is that it's the Westerners' fault, and that the Aboriginals who are living in Australia are the ones who are able to survive and thrive in these conditions because of their already spiritual connection to the land. Now, Zach, did this movie remind you of any other movies?
I feel like you're leading me somewhere very specific. Uh,
Yeah,
like
it really.
Pocahontas?
No. For me personally, it just there's a clear similarity, especially the use of indigenous culture in the movie that I'm thinking of used indigenous culture that was being sort of torn apart by. White men. Of course, it took place in America. It was, you might have heard of this movie, Three Ninjas 2 Knuckle Up.
I feel like mine was a little bit more on point. I'm just gonna throw that out there. I mean, you could even say Avatar.
And it's interesting. We always see these sort of movies that are colonial in nature, and that's really what this is. And this is sort of the first movie where we have the impact, or we get to see the after effect. So it's sort of an interesting change, both from that formula, that like Pocahontas colonial invader destroying resources, and then now we get to see it here where it's we've seen what the impact is done, and we get to see the aftermath rather than the current sort of battlefield that happens. And
It's like the colonial settlers being removed.
yeah, it's like the idea of, nature is healing itself. It is defending against people who are trying to destroy it. And there's always a plot point that indigenous people are more able to connect with nature around them. They're able to live on the land without destroying the land, and they work in harmony with it as well as protecting it and feeding from it. And you have these movies like Pocahontas, where she has a deep connection to the nature around her. And the same with Avatar, where you have the Na'vi who are able to literally, in the movie, connect with nature around them. And then this movie, it's sort of interesting. They thrive off of the environment, and it's through their sort of environmental understanding, their knowledge of nature and those resources that allow them to survive so efficiently in this particular movie. And it is a direct result of the destruction of the environment through that sort of environmental fracking metaphor that basically said the reason that they have this virus is because people decided to frack and it unleashed something. It's that disruption of nature, but specifically disrupting nature without fear of consequence and without regard for the sanctity of the land that you're on.
Respect for the land itself, but also like this idea of nature versus man is what you see here, but also it kind of breaks that idea a little bit because it's almost like you have the non-Aboriginal people that have been fracking. It's this idea of man versus nature versus the Aboriginals who are, like you mentioned before, with like the Avatar people. They're part of nature. They connect with nature on it. They're not like it's not versus. They're part of nature. They're with nature. This idea works really well in this movie because it makes you think about like, okay, so the Aboriginal people they think of themselves as part of nature, and as humans, like we are animals and we are part of nature ourselves. It's just that with our logic, we've come to remove ourselves from that point of view. And so we think of
Definitely.
ourselves as outside of nature and like almost like above it.
It's really interesting. This movie hits on those sorts of external conflicts: the man versus man versus nature, man versus society, man versus fate, really well. Specifically with the man versus nature element, the idea of fracking being the reason for everything that's going on. And in this movie, it really does feel a little bit more natural and a little less antagonistic on the side of nature. It's about this thing happened, and it wouldn't have happened had they respected the land, but it's not necessarily nature fighting back. It's just a little bit of fate, a little bit of nature at the same time.
Right. It's not really nature fighting back. It's just nature being nature, and now people are forced to interact with it in a way that we're not used to in modern life. In the beginning, they're on the boat, and his wife says, "You didn't even know anything about boats until we were like basically forced to be on this thing." So it kind of demonstrates that. Whereas like they've had to adapt to this less modern way of life, this more nature centric way of life.
Yeah, they had to change their like cultural ideals.
Right.
Because if you're not grown up as a seafarer, it's really hard to be able to just hop on a boat, figure it out, and not kill yourself and destroy the boat.
Which
those are hard.
They kind of do. But...
Yeah, they kind of. Well, no, they never destroy the boat.
Oh, it's
they
the car.
only wreck the car. Apparently, he handles boats better than he handles cars because he managed to keep the boat intact for months, but the car only lasted like, 5 hours? Talking about external conflict, one of the things I said in a previous episode is you want to have something other than just the main theme of the movie as sort of the side conflict. And I really appreciated the way that this movie weaved together Andy's story and Shumi's story, and then particularly how it weaved together both the man versus nature in terms of the actual zombie or virals, as they call them in the movie, and the way that they weaved together his fight with one of the other Eurocentric survivors that they see.
Vic.
Their conflict with Vic is really interesting. I think it was a good choice to have that almost be a really significant and central conflict in the story. In a way, it almost is as important as the main conflict. And honestly, I think that the main conflict is not man versus nature, but man versus fate. His lack of time that he has to find safety for his daughter.
Well, yeah. Well, it's funny that you mentioned man versus fate, because what's the name of the boat in the beginning where she gets bitten originally?
Serendipity?
Yep, serendipity, and that goes along very nicely with man versus fate. Yeah, so I think there are definitely a multitude of conflicts here, and like the conflict with Vic, I think actually becomes the main conflict at some point, because when Andy he's with Toomey, she kind of like opens his eyes to seeing the infected in a different way, and also thus opening the audience's eyes to see them in a different way. And she says like they've lost their souls, and she calls them ghosts, and they're not just like infected zombie creatures. They never call them zombies, which kind of like the word zombie automatically dehumanizes. And she kind of opens his eyes to like seeing them as a little more human.
It's sort of a trend in zombie movies to have like the one normal human that just goes rogue. Vic's character is so much less cartoonish than in the other iterations of those, and we actually get to see Vic treated with a level of pathos that is sort of strange and sympathetic when he's crying in the tunnel, and you're like, oh, he is a person and he's feeling. He is a bad person and we can recognize that, but you almost feel bad for him.
He's still a victim of circumstance.
He's a victim of circumstance, and that is something that this movie does well, is it gives pathos to every single character, including the infected, like Toomey's father. And I think part of that is because we get to see the infection in all of its forms. We get to see it happen very quickly, but we also get to sort of watch both Andy and Kay actively suffer through the development of the infection. And that's why I think it makes us so much more sympathetic to the plight of the zombie characters. And actually, when I was reading through this, one of the things that it suggested, it's supposed to be creating this like tree sap kind of material over them, that they're exuding this like tree sap, and that's that yellowish amber colored, and it is slowly coming from their eyes and over their mouth, and it is suffocating them. If you didn't die from your bite, you would die from the sap eventually suffocating you as your body's liquid turned to this amber material. And that is incredibly horrifying because yeah, there's the bleeding out, and that's terrible. But to really experience that slow suffocation, I think that there's a really interesting like way that we get to see the infection truly develop. We actually get to watch the 48 hours.
Let's just for a moment suspend reality and say that a zombie-like infection were to be realistic. I think this would be the most realistic kind of way that it could play out because normally like I'm thinking like Zombieland kind of thing. Like you see someone get taken down by a zombie, they get bitten, and it's like they stand back up and they're like already zombified, and it's like that is just so unrealistic. An infection cannot take over the human body that quickly.
Yeah, like World War Z. It takes
Right.
he times it. It's like 7 seconds. You know.
Right. It's no virus, no matter how potent, could do that to anybody. Even a 48-hour virus, like that's pretty powerful virus to completely take over the body. So I kind of like that more realistic way of it working. But also, I mean, let's go with the infection as a metaphor for environmental ignorance. I like the whatever the goop is. What was the secretion? What were you calling that?
Yeah, I was calling it sap.
Yeah, okay, so sap it actually comes from their eyes first, and it like kind of covers their eyes. So I think given the metaphor, it's almost like they're blind to the environmental change, which a lot of people in the world are.
And that's why they bury their heads in the sand.
Right, and they literally bury their heads in the sand, which of course is the phrase that we use for basically willful ignorance. Like you don't want to hear the truth when you bury your head in the sand.
Oh yeah, certainly. And it's interesting. There's some characters in Junji Ito, a Japanese manga artist who does surrealist horror. Who he has these characters also do that same thing. It's treated in the same way. So I think that the idea of burying one's head anywhere, it's sort of common and it's universal. And they do a good job of sort of giving that message in really subtle ways. That's what I really like about this movie, is that it's just self-contained. It has these sort of inexplicable messages sometimes that if you just watch it and think about it, it's like, oh, this really does connect. It's not so superficially stagnant like most zombie movies are, where there is like, yeah, there's a political message, there's a social underpinning to this, but really there's not. It's just they wanted to make a gory, fast, scary zombie movie. And then you have movies that try to get way too deep and then are ineffective. And I think that this movie primarily focuses on that parent relationship first and then environmental impact later. It's all about how we're trying to leave a better world for our children, which is what he is doing with his daughter Rosie. Like, that's the whole point of the movie, is that he's trying to protect his kid. And so he's protecting his kid by giving his daughter over to people who respect the environment and who can teach her to, as she grows, respect the environment as well. And I think that ties in even earlier with when he's visiting Etta. He sees the picture of all of the kids that she used to teach, and he says, oh, what happened to them? And she said, oh, they're gone. And he's like, oh, I'm so sorry. She's like, no, not literally gone. They went back. And so there's this idea of, relinquishing the kids to the people who can protect them and protect the natural world. Mm-hmm. It's sort of foreshadowed a little bit with Toomey when her and her father are sitting around the fireplace and the clever man comes up and he basically warns them. It's just like, oh, this is what happens when you leave. And her father, it was sort of implied that her father had taken Toomey out of their aboriginal natural inhabitants and moved into sort of the more industrial world. And as punishment, that is why her father became one of the virals.
It's funny that you mentioned the clever man at this moment, because Toomey also then calls him a magic man. Saying the clever man is a magic man, it's like if we're to extend the metaphor, that's basically he's the scientist telling people, hey, global warming's a real thing. Like, we're seeing evidence here. This is what's coming. Her calling him a magic man is basically the movie equating science to magic. To the ignorant people, it does seem like it's this magic, like this unbelievable kind of thing that, oh, wow, how could someone possibly predict this?
It's so funny. He disappears when they go back to rescue him, and then he's gone. He is at the end. He made it to the other side. I think that there was sort of supposed to be this metaphor that, he's there. He's saying what's happening, and he's sort of there to watch over to me. And once he sees Andy rescue her, he sort of knows that, like, okay, she's in good hands. I can leave.
Well, he's the one that kills Andy in the end, so it's interesting given like the previous stoicism that he's the one to do it. But I guess maybe that's supposed to make us feel like it's the right thing to do.
There is definitely this idea that Andy has done his job, and it's his time to leave it to the next generation of people. And so in that way, the Aboriginal people, they also sort of represent the immutability of time and the passage from one generation into the next. And by giving Rosie to them, he's leaving her with people who will teach that generation to respect nature the way that his generation did not. So I think that there's a lot of depth to this movie, and that's actually why I really like it. So I think now might be a good time to pivot into what we didn't like about the movie so much.
I did really like the movie. I think that it does a lot of things well. It breaks convention in a really refreshing way. It's just so depressing.
It is really, really dark. In the River family specifically, I don't necessarily think that their addition served as much purpose as it might have, specifically because the dad is bitten and he knows that he's going to turn, and he promised that he wouldn't leave his wife and his two daughters, and so he makes the sacrifice of killing them and himself, and he dug a grave for some reason, but like
didn't bury them.
he didn't bury them. He just killed them, and then also himself. And so it's like, who's gonna bury him, dude? So bad forethought there. But I have seen how all of these other characters, they sort of fit into that narrative. And that is the one where I don't necessarily think that they fit into the environmentalist logic.
But I think that they're kind of outside the environmental message. I think it's more of in the beginning, and then when he seeks them out to take, like, he hopes that they can take Rosie. I think that they represent the old family ideal. They seem happy. They've got two kids, mom and a dad. It's like the classic formula for
the post-nuclear family.
Right, exactly. And I think that towards the end there, I think it's to like basically tell the audience like this ideal family setup is not viable anymore.
Yeah, there's a real lack of hope message. As far as character and growth, I just don't feel like we ever got to have like pathos for them. We didn't get to know them enough to like have an emotional connection. So for them to die, it felt more shock factor rather than being like an organic part of the movie, especially because every other character that exists in the movie is so purposeful, even down to the zombies that they use. And with this family, it just felt more shock factor than I think it felt organic or natural or tugging at your heartstrings to like, oh man, this family's gonna die. That's so sad. And we've seen them from the beginning. It's like, whoa, I can't believe they just did that. Okay, so what's next? Like, what are we doing? What are we doing, Martin? It's you know what I mean. It just didn't feel like it was so important that it needed to be shown.
Yeah, I agree with you. That it's like it does seem rushed. They're like the one group of people that you don't really get to form this pathos with, because they're just not developed. But I think that's by design. A lot of what this movie accomplishes is through like how people handle loss in different ways and different kinds of loss in different ways. Mm-hmm. We experience the most literal form of loss as loss of life or loss of loved ones, loss of your home, your shelter, your safety. And then there's loss of control, which I think is what this guy is experiencing, because he got bit. It seemed like they felt like they had things under control. They had like their whole home set up.
They had enough food finally. They were going to have a nice anniversary with that bottle of wine.
Well, I'm talking about the river people.
Well, okay.
but also
My bad.
but also them. I mean, it parallels to
Yeah.
what you're talking about too. But yeah, he gets bitten unexpectedly, and there is that loss of control. Like he's like, okay, what do I do? And actually, loss of control literally as well. Like when you get bitten, you have these muscle spasms. So there's kind of this desperation that's involved in that. So I think it's another way that you see people deal with loss. A lot of what this movie's about is demonstrating that kind of thing.
One of the things that stuck with me actually last night was you saying that was a really good movie that I never want to watch again.
It's true.
And your explanation was that it's so dark, especially at the end. It's a really heavy movie. And in that way, I think that it's a really effective sort of horror movie. And we so often think about these conventions of horror. This movie, it really plays to like a deeper sort of underlying sense of fear throughout the whole thing, because as the movie went on, I personally never really found the virals scary. They were disgusting and they were gross and they were ugly, but they weren't necessarily scary, because you can see that people handle them, and seeing other people handle and survive them, it gives you a sense of confidence that you might be able to do that. But what gets you is just the absolute tragedy and the sense of hopelessness that you get from watching the wife get bitten and then the husband get bitten, and then having to like see him slowly turn and like lose himself is really difficult to watch, and in a way that I think makes it horrifying but much more personal. It reminds me of a lot of the Stephen King stories that aren't supernatural in nature. He's really good at creating stories that can sort of tug on the heartstrings and be entirely feasible within the world that we live in. And obviously this movie is not, but it is much more personal, and I think that personal quality is what makes it a horror movie.
I felt a little bit of fear from the infected people early on, like when I didn't see what they looked like, because I thought maybe they would be like fast and they would be like a prevalent threat throughout the movie, but they do kind of have that slow zombie shamble that's classic to the genre. And that's what I mean. I've never found zombies to be that frightening of a creature, just because it's like in that classic way, it's like they're very slow. And I guess the fear would come from like a horde.
It always depends on your zombie though, Zach, because I would say the zombies in Night of the Living Dead, slow. Return of the Living Dead, fast, and they can kind of talk.
Oh.
Then you think World War Z, where they're goddamn scaling buildings, versus Dawn of the Dead, where they're relatively fast, versus The Walking Dead, where they are slow. I mean, there was sort of this trend that started with 28 Days Later of really revamping the zombie genre to be like, okay, our slow zombies are out. Every zombie that we have now is gonna be Usain Bolt levels of fast. And this movie does take it back to the shambling, which I think
this isn't an action movie. And
yeah, I mean, the fast zombies are cheap.
Right, and it's like, yeah, it's to get those action sequences in. Like, you can't have an intense action sequence with a slow zombie. That's just not going to work.
Unless you do it all in slow motion and Matrix style like they do in Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 before it went off the goddamn rails.
Hey, 4 was like, okay.
All right, well, thanks everybody. That's the end of the podcast. There will no longer be any episodes after this.
Wait, did you think that was bad?
Are you talking about the video game?
Yes.
I'm talking about the movies.
Oh, well, there we go.
Okay, all right, friendship back on. We are going to continue episode of the podcast. Stay tuned for next week's episode. No, I'm talking about the movies.
Yeah, I mean, it's like for a game, it's like, yes, obviously you're going to want to do like more of an action type thing, and I think that then That doesn't necessarily make a good movie.
I don't think that this would make a good video game series.
Cargill?
Yeah. It's kind of
No.
got a The Last of Us vibe.
Martin Freeman, he was Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit. This is kind of
Mm-hmm.
like, this is like post-apocalyptic Middle Earth. Maybe this is like before he gave the ring to
Yeah.
Frodo. Is this all a retelling of Lord of the Rings, where
You might have
the
gone too far.
the baby represents the ring?
Yeah. How are you going to work this one out?
Okay, so hear me out. What is The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings if not a story of
Cargo.
man getting along with nature? There's all the Ents. There's the Isengard and Saruman. They're like taking out the forest, and there's that whole environmental message there.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah. So I started this as a joke, and now I'm completely serious about it.
Now you're totally invested.
Anyways, what were you about to say? I'm sure that was a really thought out concept that you were getting into, and then I completely derailed it. Oh no, we were just talking about video games, weren't we?
Yeah, we were talking
Okay.
about video games.
Anyways, so, while we're just something that occurred to me when we were talking about Vic earlier, and I called Vic a victim of circumstance. That I wonder if that was a connection that was meant to be made, because
That's an interesting idea.
In crime shows, yeah, they often call victims Vics for short, and I wonder if that's kind of like you're supposed to sympathize for him more than I did.
I think that they do try to make him seem like he has a victim, status at the end of their engagement with him. And they do try to like all of a sudden do a 180 and it's just like, oh, but see, he's a victim of all of this too.
Too
And
little,
Andy
too
is,
late.
Ultimately the bigger person is just like, I'm going to let you live.
The very first thing that we learn about him from Lorraine is that she's like basically calling him inhumane. She says that
She says, you're the first people I've seen. Because I remember when we were watching it, I said to you, she's trying to say that Vic's not a person.
right, yeah, and she says the people who are still people anyways, and they spend all this time dehumanizing him, and then after that we find out he's a really terrible person for many reasons, and then it's like too little too late in the last 30 seconds of his screen time. I don't know if it's supposed to be this redemption moment or not.
I mean, there's no way to like this character, and I don't think that they want you to like them, but
I think his character is representative of all the issues at play in this movie. Like that his kind of character is like what caused the issue in the first place. Like he's looking to take advantage of this post-apocalyptic situation. Like he's like, oh, like the people who have the shiny things in this new world are going to be the ones who are in power.
he's a capitalist, and he's representing this like capitalist ideal and the greed of disregard for human life.
Right, and not only disregard for other people, but a disregard for the environment itself. That greed is what leads to fracking in the first place.
People will sacrifice the environment for their greed. It's because they know that they don't have to live out the effects of the consequences. It's just like, it doesn't matter if the environment collapses and the earth becomes a flaming ball of heat death in 70 years. I'll be gone by then, so it doesn't matter. And that's
Right.
what's sort of being reinforced with Vic's character. Or rather, Vic is the representation of the everyman who sees this as the opportunity to finally rise to something, which ultimately he can't do because it's too late for him to go anywhere.
I think that goes along with what I said earlier about like a lot of different kinds of loss going on here. Like his is almost like a loss of reality, where like he has to deal with this new world, and even I think Lorraine says that he's trying to like he thinks that the world's going to go back to how it was, which just is not realistic.
He has a sense of hope that is really sort of malicious in a way. He's hopeful because he thinks that he can gain something from it.
He's a victim of his own hope.
Is it time?
It's time.
It's time. Okay, so first I have a question for you. What is a snail's favorite movie?
A snail's favorite movie. Escargot.
It's Cargo.
Man, these questions are so easy.
The name for the trivia I came up with was "What's the matter? Car got your trivia, like cat got your tongue." Yeah, I thought about this too. This one was hard. Single word titles are hard, so kudos to you on all of the other ones that I have had you do that I didn't ask for. All right, so trivia question number 1. Besides this, what is the only other zombie film to feature Martin Freeman? Option 1, Dawn of the Dead, Shaun of the Dead, DayZ, and World War Z.
Oh boy. I mean, I still haven't seen too many zombie movies. One because I should probably say, Val, my wife, does not like zombie movies. It's like her one kind of horror movie that she deeply dislikes them. So I have not seen many of them. I'm gonna go with DayZ.
So he was actually in the movie Shaun of the Dead.
Oh, that was gonna be my second guess.
And would you like to guess how long he is in the movie?
He probably like gets eaten or something.
Less than 2 minutes. He actually survives the movie.
Oh.
So he plays the character Declan, and if you looked up Martin Freeman playing Declan, you would not recognize him because he looks totally different. Martin Freeman is a frequent collaborator with Edgar Wright, and has actually appeared in another movie as well, which is the End of the World. And these are both part of the same trilogy of movies, which include The End of the World, Hot Fuzz, and Shaun of the Dead.
We'll have to see it, obviously. I know, very
it's a great
basic.
Movie. I saw it when it first came out. We didn't know anything about it. It was a holiday, and my sister and I went to like a family video, and we were like, oh, let's get like a zombie movie. And the last time I had watched a zombie movie, she had made me watch Return of the Living Dead, and I was like scarred by it. But we got this movie called Shaun of the Dead. We saw it, and so we're like, okay, we'll get this and we'll watch it, and we'll have all the family there, and we put it in, and we did not stop laughing. So yeah, definitely recommend, and we'll have to do a watch on that one eventually. So question number 2, Zach. What other 5-letter film or television series ending in Argo has Martin Freeman appeared in?
Fargo. Right?
Is that your answer?
Well, now you got me second guessing myself. Yeah, Fargo.
Fargo. It is Fargo. The
Is there even another
2014 black comedy crime drama TV series from 2014. I thought you said Argo, which is a movie with
no.
Casey Affleck, I think.
Yeah, no, not Argo.
Fargo.
So
yes. Yeah, he was in Fargo as one of the leads, and he did in fact win a couple of awards for his role.
Yeah, he's good in that.
Moving on. So, besides being the leading man of this movie, what other significant production role do the cast and directors of the film say that Martin Freeman took during the production?
Did he do some writing?
He didn't do writing, no.
Okay. Makeup artist.
No, that would also have been a good one. He actually helped with directing specifically the scenes that took place between him and Toomey. Because he was considered on set to be such a consummate professional and such a hardworking actor that for many of those scenes, he would act as both the coach and the director of the scene, taking over for the film's 2 directors, because this was their first feature film. It was directed by Ben Howling and Yolanda Ramke, and because it was their first film, obviously they had not worked on a full-length production of this scale before, and so he took charge of a lot of those particular scenes to make it easier and to overall help them.
Well, it's a great first film for them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it all came about because in 2014, they did a short movie version of this film on YouTube. It's garnered 13 million views. So it was sort of this slew of films at the time that were being made off of movies that were short films on YouTube first. It was becoming a trend at this time. And so This obviously was one of the more successful ones. We're going to talk about one of the other ones later in a different episode because I've got it saved for us to talk about. So my last question, this movie has the special distinction of being what? A, Australia's first publicly syndicated zombie film. B, Martin Freeman's first on-screen wife. C, the first Netflix original from Australia. Or D, the first film to show the Adnyamanthia people on screen while also having consultants on set that wrote and could accurately depict the indigenous Australian Aboriginal life and cultural practices, as well as fair treatment for both the cast and the land that they were on.
It's gotta be D.
Is that your final answer?
Yeah.
It is not D. It was Netflix's first, or it was Australia's first Netflix original film.
That's the last one I would have guessed. It seemed like, I'm like, no, that's definitely not it. Australia has to have had something else.
So that is the end of my trivia for you. So how did I do? Rating 1 out of 10.
I'll give you 7.
Okay, I'll take it.
Lots of centering around Martin Freeman.
You want to know why I centered it so much about Martin Freeman? He's the only person that I was able to find a lot of comprehensive information on. Mostly because he's the only really super well-known internationally recognized actor. Simone Landers, the girl who played Toomey, who really has the other starring role in this film. It was her debut, as well as the other main character of the film being Rosie, who obviously also hasn't really acted because they were played by 4 different children.
Oh, is it only 4?
It was only 4, probably because they needed to constantly hydrate these children in this barren Australian outback.
Yeah, I thought it would have been 7. With baby actors, it's a baby.
It's all or nothing. It's just does it look like a child? It'll work.
No one's looking at the baby all that much because the baby don't have no lines.
Well, you say that, but do you remember what Bella's baby looked like in Twilight Breaking Dawn, the 4th film?
I haven't seen those movies.
They CGI'd the baby, Zach.
All right, that's enough of that.
Instead of just having they CGI'd the baby. I'm going to send you a picture of it, but
I don't want to see any CGI'd babies.
I'm going to send it to you at 2 a.m.
And I'm not going to look at it until... You know what's going to happen? I'm just going to very sleepily look at my phone at 6 in the morning, and then I'm not going to be able to fall back asleep because that image is going to be seared into my retinas.
All right, thank you everyone for tuning into this week's episode of Watch No Evil featuring Cargo. This is Matt.
And this is Zach.
And we'll catch you same time next week.